Star Wars The Clone Wars has 40 unfinished episodes, which have since come up against, quote, retcons with newer release stories. In this video, I will break these down and explain why that doesn't mean that the entire story arc isn't or can't be canon. We start with what Pablo Hidalgo said back in 2014. Even though those Clone Wars episodes did not get publicly revealed, we still look at their core stories as having happened. Specifically, the core stories section of the quote. That tells us right there that it doesn't mean specific details. We also have to take into account that none of these arcs ever made it into full production. While yes, some did get voice acting as they were intended to be developed for release, they were ultimately left as voiceover, story reels, models, designs, and draft scripts when the show was cancelled in March 2013. As these stories were never finalised, they could have had any number of changes, big or small, done to them had they actually gone through the complete production gauntlet, as happened with episodes they did finish throughout the original production, which would be known if you watch any of the behind-the-scenes material on them. In 2014, Lucasfilm decided to reset the canon slate, stating that everything released from that point onwards, whether it's a novel, live-action movie, or anything in between, is on an equal canon basis. While that was the marketed narrative from 2014 Lucasfilm, which was also created before they even knew that Disney Plus would be a thing, the years since have revealed that in reality, they still use an internal tier system where on-screen content takes priority. This has been seen in such cases like The Mandalorian changing details of Cobb Vanth, the Ahsoka novel's core story outlines being reused for the 6th episode of Tales of the Jedi, which recreates the same story but with completely different details, as well as recently with the 2nd season of Andor, completely changing the story of K2SO's origin, which was previously told in a one-shot comic. Even on-screen content still differs in specific details between the different projects, such as Mon Mothma's speech against Emperor Palpatine being completely different within Andor compared to its holographic depiction within the 3rd season of Star Wars Rebels, with Mothma's words and clothing being completely different. Another example is how Star Wars Rebels has inconsistencies with Saw Gerrera, due to Season 3 of that show being developed with the version of Saw from the original version of Rogue One before the reshoots. Saw in Andor spans across multiple years, intersecting with Rebels Season 3, where Saw is bald and more sane, which doesn't match how he's portrayed in the entirety of Andor Season 2. These changes are done as to not restrict the storytellers from telling a story they want to tell. Different forms of medium being created by different people also varies in interpretation from both the author and the viewer. The Bounty Hunter arc has several character fates that seem to have been ignored within other projects. The first one is that of Aurra Sing. Kyle Newman, who himself had a role of a Toon character within the episodes, has stated that Jamae King's character of Aurra Sing died within the story arc, but then Solo, a Star Wars story, released in 2018 and seemingly revealed that Beckett killed her by pushing her off of a cliff. However, come the end of the film, it is revealed that Beckett is 100% not a trustworthy character. We have to remember that Solo was made during a time where that unfinished story arc was seemingly never going to get finished, and beyond that, it was before the Disney Plus era of Star Wars that has since referenced the unfinished story a bunch of times. There are multiple ways this can be worked around. Either we tweak what happens within the unfinished Bounty Hunter arc, because after all it was never finished and thus the details weren't solidified, or we can keep Aura's Bounty Hunter arc death intact and have some supplementary material confirm that Beckett lied and took credit for a death he had nothing to do with. I personally have always headcanoned the latter. The second character fate seems to be that of bounty hunter Suji, voiced by Anna Graves, who is confirmed to be part of the arc via a July 2012 Dave Filoni Facebook post of when the voiceover sessions were in progress, as well as Anna herself posting on her now inactive Twitter account with Daniel Logan about her involvement within the episodes. Suji's death, as far as we know, is only implied via the released CW525 Boba vs. Bane dual clip when Embo drops her blaster and Marok drops her knife. If Suji did indeed die in the arc, then her inclusion within the Aftermath trilogy of novels comes into question. However, it seems she doesn't feature that prominently within the novels, most likely not being a part of that trilogy's core story. Due to the clear mythology/canon tier system they use, I personally doubt that Suji's inclusion within the novel would prevent them from killing her off in a finalised version of the arc if they ever decide to finish it. The fates of characters within that novel trilogy could have always been what the author personally thought happened to them, made at a time within Lucasfilm when those characters weren't considered to be used significantly anywhere else. If the rumours of Embo being in The Mandalorian and Grogu are true, then that would also bring his supposed retirement from bounty hunting, as depicted in those novels, into question as well. They could always recontextualise that Suji brought up her niece during the Clone Wars and had her niece continue on Suji's legacy after her death. So far, Suji has not featured within anything on screen since her assumed death within the unfinished Bounty Hunter arc, so within the on-screen continuity, she is pretty much dead unless she turns up on screen in the future. Crystal Crisis on Utapau may be the most well-known unfinished story arc, but the only continuity issue I've noticed with it is quite minor. I know some people question the whole thing about Utapau appearing before Revenge of the Sith, but it's very clearly established within the story arc that the Separatists don't occupy the planet here. They just work with the Suji arms dealers, including Endente, and the Powans to acquire the huge Kyber crystal. The show also keeps up its stick of having Anakin never directly encounter Grievous, while giving him yet another fight with Obi-Wan. The actual continuity issue here has to do with the character of Kalani. Kalani is featured within CW604, The Big Bang, the fourth and final episode of the story arc, where he gets destroyed with Grievous's entire fleet and the Kyber crystal. We know that this has since been contradicted by the fact that the Star Wars Rebels Season 3 episode, The Last Battle, featured Kalani still on Agamar after Dooku sent him there at the conclusion of the Onderon Clone Wars arc. This is minor in the fact that his role within CW604 The Big Bang could literally be filled by any super tactical droid unit, and I 100% expect him to be replaced if a finished version of the Crystal Crisis arc ever sees the light of day. It would make sense to replace Kalani with Kraken, the super tactical droid that appeared in 3 of the 4 Lost Missions arcs. This would also be a subtle nod to how Crystal Crisis was meant to feature within Season 6, alongside 2 of those stories he appears in. The droid also had a different voice actor per arc, so that trend could also be kept either by keeping Greg Berger's lines or by getting a new voice actor. The unfinished Dark Disciple arc has a few detailed discrepancies of its own. The first has to do with the design of Ventress's yellow lightsaber hilt, something of which was included on the novel adaptation's cover art. The design has since been used within the Twins production Clone Wars Final Season episode, The Phantom Apprentice, being featured as the second half to Maul's reforged dual-bladed lightsaber. Due to this, the Bad Batch Season 3 decided to give Ventress a new unique hilt, making it curved just like her previous sabers. The debate of whether Ventress has had 2 yellow sabers or whether this hilt is a replacement design has been ongoing for quite some time by this point, but I think it's more than likely now that this curved hilt has just always been her yellow saber, and I expect to see it included if they ever finish the on-screen version of the Dark Disciple arc. The other detailed discrepancy has to do with the character of Marg Krim. It is implied by Ventress that the Black Sun will murder Marg Krim as revenge for her and Quinlan Vos breaking into their Mustafar fortress and rescuing his family. This is something that the Son of Dathomir comics seem to follow up with, as Fife is in charge of the Pikes there, with Marg Krim nowhere to be seen. We know that Marg Krim now clearly survives this supposed fate, as he appears as one of the Syndicate leaders within the Phantom Apprentice. It's not hard to fix this discrepancy with supplementary material either. They can establish that Olmec, who was running the Shadow Collective at the time, could have stepped in before any blood was spilled, with him using Maul as a threatening device to keep them in order. Them being none the wiser that Maul was actually indisposed as Palpatine's prisoner during these events. Considering we only have the novel adaptation of this story arc to go off, we have to also remember that with these print media adaptations come embellishments of certain aspects of the story. Case in point for the Dark Disciple novel is how we get to the inner monologues of Ventress and Vos, while it removes several sequences featured within the released story reel clips. Yoda and the Bad Batch on Kashyyyk has more evidence to suggest that it did happen than it didn't, considering all of the confirmed tie-ins within the Bad Batch Season 2 episode, Tribe, as well as the Bad Batch Season 3 confirming the Crosshair is also familiar with Kashyyyk. The one thing that comes to mind that may be brought up is how the Batch don't seem to recognise the Netcasters or Mylea within the Tribe episode. This can simply be down to the fact that the Batch have done quite a lot since their original visit to Kashyyyk. Their lives have changed drastically, and they've encountered quite a lot of creatures and foes within that time span. We also have to remember that the episode was already quite heavy on callbacks to their unfinished arc, so perhaps it was a creative decision to not have them recognise every single shared element between the two stories, as to limit the amount of exposition that they give to Omega and the audience. This story arc also has to be moved a bit later into 19BBY to account for the fact that the first Bad Batch Clone Wars arc was moved into the Outer Rim Sieges, though I doubt this would change its story in any way. The only thing that really comes to mind in regards to contradictions with the Son of Dathomir arc is how the Shadow Collective disbands at the end of the arc, with their only inclusion within the Siege of Mandalore being confirmed to have been added later in that story arc's Revival Twins production. We can now assume that Rook's empty threat at the end of the arc isn't empty anymore, that the Mandalorians did force the Shadow Collective back together by force. It would fit into their uneasy relationship that is depicted within the episode Together Again, and is something I have also suggested could be implemented into the Dark Disciple arc. I do think if they ever finish the on-screen version of the story, that Marg Krim could replace Fife as the leader of the Pikes, as that role within the story could practically be filled with any Pike leader, and we know that Marg Krim doesn't die now anyway. It seems that Crimson Dawn have also been added into the Syndicate by the time of the finished Ahsoka's Walkabout arc, but that can always be something that gets established after the Son of Dathomir arc, due to Maul's capture most likely preventing it from joining beforehand. I personally think Crimson Dawn shouldn't have been added into the Clone Wars and should have been a Dark Times organisation formed after Order 66, because Maul's threat in Together Again depends on if the viewer even knows who they are, which if the viewer is watching Star Wars in chronological order, that's the first time they pop up in any form. Just like with the Dark Disciple novel, the comic adaptation of the unfinished telescripts has its own embellishments and cutbacks due to the format of the medium, lending to just its core story being counted as canon in regards to other on-screen events. Return to the Jedi is one of two arcs that people just instantly write off as being impossible, But this story arc can still work despite discrepancies from newer stories it comes up against. Due to Ahsoka's walkabout now being placed just before the Outer Rim sieges within the timeline, this story arc now takes place before it, and while its original title suggests that Ahsoka would rejoin the Order at its conclusion, that doesn't have to be the case. Ahsoka would return because she cares about the Jedi as people and knows they're in danger. She'd put any feelings aside and be more Jedi-like than she'd even admit. It's not a case of she wants to go back, it's a case of she has to. The Tarkin novel states that Vader doesn't know of the Sith Shrine. This is a very small issue that doesn't invalidate the whole arc, because who knows if Anakin even saw the shrine himself. This is before you again think about how Lucasfilm have not stopped specific details featured within print media in the past from preventing them from telling stories they want to, with another example being how Tales of the Empire has Thrawn work with Pelion before the canon Thrawn novels have assigned him to Thrawn right before the Purgle incident on Lothal. The Tarkin novel could also be being told from a biased perspective where they might not know that Anakin/Vader knows of the shrine. We don't even know if any of the events of that story arc were ever shared with Republic officials. It could have been kept confidential by the Jedi Order in the same way as Dooku being involved in the clone's creation. There are countless examples of novel stories that are supposedly canon being, quote, detail retconned by newer on-screen projects, so why would this story be any different? Ahsoka Season 2 reusing the ancient Sith droid design also doesn't mean that the story arc is invalid, because Peridea is clearly some sort of Force nexus within that other galaxy, combining multiple different Force-related things like the Night Sisters and the Mortis Overlords. So it's not far-fetched to assume that these Sith droids exist within multiple places within the Star Wars universe. This story arc could be used to explain why Ahsoka is surprised that Maul is on Mandalore during Walkabout, as if she never interacted with the Jedi since she left the Order. The last info she'd have known of Maul's whereabouts was that he was on Mandalore, as that's the last time Obi-Wan saw him, and he would have informed the Jedi of what happened with Satine. Though, we do know that something must have stalled the Republic's initial invasion of Mandalore, considering this doesn't go ahead until much later within the Siege of Mandalore arc. Ahsoka would be shocked that Maul is on Mandalore if she knows by that point that the Jedi assume that Dooku is the Master and Maul is the apprentice, as was the case with Son of Dathomir. She'd assume that Maul is involved with the Separatists, so why would he be on Mandalore, which is a neutral world? There doesn't seem to be anything directly contradictory to the Saving Voss arc, based off of its Dark Disciple novel adaptation, though I will mention how Tales of the Underworld has depicted the very final scene that would have been featured within CW 708, The Path, that being Ventress's funeral on Dathomir. Said scene would most likely now be removed from a finished on-screen version of the Path story, and they'd have the story end with the Jedi Temple sequence, where Voss and Kenobi honour Ventress as a friend to the Jedi. This would also have the added benefit of having the episode bookended by Jedi Temple scenes, as it starts in the Jedi Temple with Voss and Ventress agreeing to assassinate Dooku on Christophsis. Again, just like with the previous Dark Disciple and Son of Dathomir arcs, the released version we have of the story has its own embellishments due to its form of media, with Tales of the Underworld only counting its core story elements as canon, as it has changed several specific details from the novel, including the outfit Ventress was buried in, the dialogue Voss has within the funeral sequence, as well as what happens when Ventress is buried, with the novel depicting the Night Sisters welcoming her, while Tales of the Underworld instead depicts Talzin welcoming her and giving her a choice, something which reinforces that Talzin is dead herself, which is clearly a core outcome of the Son of Dathomir arc. This story arc could also be used to explain why Ahsoka is salty with Anakin when reuniting with him in Old Friends Not Forgotten, with her deciding to stay but not rejoin the Order after the conclusion of the previous arc to help them approach Ventress, considering she made a rapport with her in Season 5 and promised her a pardon. Ahsoka would work on behalf of the Jedi to convince Ventress to rescue Quinlan Vos from Dooku, with the arc originally being planned for her to feature in this role, which the novel adaptation had to substitute with a Car Deshu due to not having the context of the Sith Shrine arc. By the arc's end, Ahsoka could have her friction with the Jedi reinforced when they decide to play politics and get Quinlan Vos to try to assassinate the Separatist leader. When this goes horribly wrong and gets Christophsis citizens caught in the crossfire, she could give Anakin an ultimatum: either stay with her and help the citizens, or do what the Council says and pursue Vos, Ventress and Dooku alongside Obi-Wan. Anakin would be forced to unfortunately choose the latter, which would cause Ahsoka to leave off-screen. Anakin would return after Ventress's death to find her gone. This being added into the Saving Vos arc could then act as a contrast to how the sequence between Anakin and Ahsoka at the end of the new Padawan section of the Clone Wars movie was added by Filoni as the original ending to when that story was a standalone episode. Both of these big character moments taking place on Christophsis. Ahsoka doesn't have to officially rejoin the Order to work with them again. There's wiggle room there, just like how Count Dooku in Tales of the Jedi had already left the Order but was allowed to visit, with Ahsoka gaining that privilege by solving the plot in the Sith Shrine. The 4-episode Rex and R2 arc seems to currently be the story with the least amount of contradictions due to how standalone and isolated its entire premise is. Though we have seemingly seen the main setting of the arc be repurposed within the Bad Batch, that being the Ryloth Moon. The arc's time frame is now most likely during the Outer Rim sieges, but I doubt that would change anything for the story itself. The story would add additional context to Rex's outlook on the war depicted within the Siege of Mandalore, as well as give backstory to how he is able to fly the Y-Wing. I often wonder a lot about this story arc, considering it seems to have given Rex a direct focus, something I personally would love to see, and something I think he deserves after being used to further the stories of both the Bad Batch and the other characters within Star Wars Rebels, as well as him being absent within the live-action projects. Just like with Return to the Jedi, this arc is instantly written off just because it involved a now legend species, but what people seem to forget is that the Yuuzhan Vong that would have been featured within this arc would have not been the ones from the expanded universe, with George Lucas's sequel trilogy plans also wiping out the possibility of the expanded universe version of the Vong to be canon within his on-screen continuity. Like with the rest of the Clone Wars, George Lucas did not get the production team to follow the old expanded universe outside of approving cameos or references, and this arc would have not been any different. We also know that the on-screen canon has since brought in things like Grand Admiral Thrawn, who was once an EU-only character. The Yuuzhan Vong's role within this story arc would have been very minimal, and they'd have essentially been retooled as the Star Wars equivalent of the grey alien archetype. Due to this minimal inclusion, it is not impossible for their role within the story to be relegated to another original species if they really don't want to use the Vong for whatever reason, which I don't know why they wouldn't, considering they've not been used elsewhere within the current continuity, and they unfortunately won't tell any more stories within the old expanded universe one. For all we know, the canon news on Vong could already be considered as the grey alien version planned for this story arc, hence why the canon Thrawn novels had to replace them with another species called the Grisk, as the grey alien Vong could be off limits to use elsewhere. If this story was based more on the X-Files than just featuring an abduction event, which is plausible considering it's 4 episodes long, then it could have explored how the Republic already has a lot of Empire-like secret government cover-ups and conspiracies going on, which would make it fit more with some of the other political arcs of the show, and depict how the Republic didn't just become the Empire overnight. Due to very brief details shared about Padmé's final story arc, we only know of one contradiction, and it by no means makes this entire story invalid. This is within the arc's 3rd episode, production code CW719, which featured the supposed assassination of the Quarren leader, No Siree, who survives, at least in the comic world, thanks to the Resistance Allegiance sequel-era comic. Besides the aforementioned statements of how something being established in a comic won't exactly stop Lucasfilm from telling a story if they want to, this can be fixed pretty easily because the Bad Batch has borderline already done the same thing with Orn Free Tar. Orn Free Tar, for all intents and purposes, was killed off within Season 1 of the Bad Batch, with it more than likely being the intent for that episode. But because he is featured within an earlier release novel, Lords of the Sith, set after these events, a line of dialogue from Admiral Rampart was added to seemingly confirm his recovery in due time. This to me is basically the same exact thing that happened with the stealth ship within Season 2 of the Clone Wars. George Lucas wanted the small ship to have a cloaking device and didn't care that he had dialogue within The Empire Strikes Back that contradicted that, so Dave Filoni decided to put a line of dialogue from Anakin to align up with the general consensus set up within that pre-established movie. This same exact procedure can happen with No Siree. He can be borderline killed within this story arc, but a single line of dialogue stating he's in a coma and will recover could always be added to justify his later survival. This would still lead to the events of Tikki's replacing him as leader for this story arc. This is before we talk about whether No Siree actually did die within the arc to begin with. He could have always faked his death for some reason, perhaps as some plan involving the fact that Tikki's is a separatist. Again, we don't know the full details of the arc, or how it would have ended. We only have out-of-context information. I will once again reiterate how all these arcs are still core story canon, as they were never fully produced, their details were never finalised, and thus these individual contradictions with newer projects do not invalidate an entire 4-episode story arc from having happened. Lucasfilm's tendency to keep referencing these unfinished story arcs, to the point that Ventress's Tales of the Underworld episodes are literally an epilogue to her 8 unfinished Clone Wars ones, reinforces exactly why we need them finished. George Lucas isn't coming back, which, don't get me wrong, him and Filoni were huge parts of the Clone Wars original production, but they are far from being the only people who contributed to these unfinished stories, and all of their work deserves to be finished and seen. Lucas sold the company knowing fully well he wouldn't be there to see all these remaining story arcs through production. He could have decided to end the show much earlier than production season 7, so he could have been around to see the final arc through to the end, but he didn't. which makes it likely that in the same vein as expecting them to use his sequel treatments, he expected the remainder of Clone Wars to be finished without him. Dave Filoni stated during the magazine Star Wars Insider 137 in late 2012 that he would continue to make the show for as long as it was watched, and stated how Lucas had taught him to make all these decisions without him, clearly showing that before Disney decided to reset the entire Star Wars slate in March 2013, axing not just Clone Wars, but other in-development projects like 1313 and Detours, that he was willing to complete the remainder of the show without George Lucas. We know that Lucasfilm could finish these stories if they wanted to. The more they continue to reference them within these other projects, the more alienating it is that these stories that seem to be as relevant today as to the day they were cancelled are just being left unfinished, while also being treated like the audience completely knows them. The overall core stories of all 10 of these unfinished arcs are worth any specific detail changes they may have to do to them in order to comply with current continuity. I doubt that any of them need as much of a drastic change as Ahsoka's walkabout went through, with 2 entire characters being swapped out. While it was nice to see another clip from the unfinished Bounty Hunter arc at Celebration 2025, I can't help but feel like they're just using these unfinished stories as jingle keys. They know we want them, so why tease us with it if we are supposed to move on and accept that these 40 unfinished episodes will never be finished? At the very least, it's highly likely that those 4 unfinished Bounty Hunter arc story reels exist in full, considering based on the established order that they created things in, the reels are usually created before they get the main voice actors in to record, which we know they did for this arc. So, if the unfinished Bounty Hunter arc exists with its main voice acting sessions done and has full reels, why can't we get them released in the same vein as Crystal Crisis on Utapau? It's a given that only the core story is canon there, considering the story is unfinished. But even if not everyone understands that, they could always add text at the start of each episode to inform the viewer. In a way, them holding onto that unfinished story feels like it gives potential false hope that they'll finish it one day, something all the references to these unfinished stories also contributes to, but whether they actually ever will remains to be seen. I now have an active channel membership available. This will grant you exclusive perks like emojis in the comments, usernames listed in my outros, and updates to what's coming next posted exclusively for members in the community tab. But the best feature is you get 5 days early access to new videos, and you will be supporting me at the same time. To find out more, you can click the join button on my channel page. Thank you to anyone who considers becoming a channel member. Thank you for watching. Please see the video description below for interesting links, sources, and credits. My current goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, so if you enjoyed, please like, subscribe, and comment. Until the next time, goodbye.